And we're live. And I've pressed the button. So let's make a deal before we really get started here. You're going to sit and listen to this. If you're in the chat or checking this out on YouTube after the fact, feel free to leave comments, ask questions, do all you got to do. Feel free to share this with other people. And in return for that, as I adjust my microphone, you won't mention that I'm still fighting a cold. And so periodically there are going to be short breaks where I have to either like hack up a lung or sniffle. And I promise not to do that too loudly into the microphone. How does that sound? Is that a good deal? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, guys, gals, non-binary pals, friends, writers, makers, doers of stuff, welcome back to How Do I Write This, episode 2, where tonight I promise you that if you follow this and if you're going to go through this step by step, you will get published. I swear to you, this could be very easily the best 2-hour-ish workshop I've ever done. I am so excited for this tonight. I am so happy to do this, to share this with you, to help you, to check this out. I am super excited. And thanks to all of you hanging out in chat. I see you. Hello. I hope you're well. All of the people who have just recently followed, thank you for following. I really appreciate it. People who have checked this out on YouTube, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you're brand new and you have no idea what's going on, I'm John Adamus. I'm the writer next door, and it is my actual job to help you write better. And I do that across many platforms, Twitch being one of them. And this is How Do I Write This, sort of a catch-all workshop going genre by genre to walk you through the idea stage all the way through the publication marketing stage for a book. I'm going to give you as much look behind the curtain and I guess as much recipe as to how the sausage gets made as possible. I want to equip you with the best tools I know and the best tools you could possibly think of. I want you to succeed in this environment. I want you to succeed writing science fiction, and I'm going to give you as many advantages as I can and give you as many of the they're not quite secrets, but the things nobody talks about that I think more people should talk about. And it occurs to me that my printer's going off for some reason, so that'll be nice to add that background noise. So let me drop this. I don't know why the printer's going off. Oh, no, I know exactly why the printer's going off. So while we take a second for my printer to do printer things, and I swear to you, if it beeps because it's out of paper, I'm throwing this across the room. But about an hour and 20 minutes ago, I clicked print on a thing, and it's just now printing. Because that's how life works. So isn't that fantastic? We're just going to hang out a second and listen to my printer print, and then I'm going to pick this up. And I cannot begin to describe to you how aggravating it is that this is happening right as I'm about to start talking, because I really thought this shit was over. So I'm just gonna lean over and turn the damn thing off. How's that? Okay. It's going off now. Bye-bye. Oh, it's not going off. I hate this printer. I hate this printer so much. Are we off now? Are we good? Are we good? I know, Linus. I know, buddy. I know. You can get on the printer now. It's not doing its evil possessed dance. Okay. Sorry. We're back now. Okay. I'm almost tempted to just start over and pretend that didn't happen. But you know what? That would mean I'd have to edit stuff, and I don't want to edit stuff because I don't feel good. So heck with it. We're just leaving it in because we keep it real here. Is that how I'm using it? Is that how that phrase gets used? I don't really know. Suffice to say, I am super excited to get into this, and I'm gonna sit here, and like use the good presentation posture. My junior year of college professor would be super pumped right now to know that I am using full professional presentation posture. All right, let's do a quick sound check to make sure that I've got the... I don't know why my sound is so wonky. Oh, it's just quiet. It was okay, whatever. All right. Apologies for the technical stuff. I really thought it wouldn't sound like that. So that's lovely. Anyway, tonight we're doing science fiction. And we're going to start all the way from the beginning. Now, some of this material, I have to say, some of this material is slightly repeated from last week when we talked about fantasy, because I don't know if you know this, science fiction and fantasy overlap. They share a lot of genealogy in their history. They share a lot of the same sort of traits when it comes to general story construction. And we're going to have to recap just a little bit. Just bear with me. You might have heard some of this stuff before. It's going to be okay because we're going to deviate quickly from the old material into new stuff real fast. We are going to start by building our story triangle, which is character, plot, and world. We're going to start with character. Why? Because we always start with character. Because if we didn't start with character, well, you'd be listening to a different person trying to tell you how to write a book. We start with character because the reader is a human being and the reader wants to invest their time, energy, and attention in the story of another being that they feel on some level they can relate to. So we start with characters. Now, our character in science fiction, first and foremost, has to be a being the reader can relate to, and it has to be a being with a very clear trajectory ahead of them. They have to be somebody who's going to want a thing, to do a thing, to change a thing, to be a thing, to change some circumstance in their current life and go forward. They got to have a want, a need, a lack, a goal, a longing. They got to go look at the twin suns of their desert planet. They got to go stare out at the stars as a spaceship is being built. They got to, wonder what life is like in the moon of their dreams. They got to have a thing that drives them, that pushes them so that they're not complacent. Being not complacent is critical. Like critical for science fiction. Because if you ever want to grind a science fiction story to a dead halt, like just bring everything down and stop it flat, you just make people complacent. It's the fastest way to short circuit science fiction and wreck it. You need a character who has a thing that's pushing them forward. Now, whether that thing is a combination of a moral code plus a want, that's fine, or whether it's just a goal, or whether it's just an emptiness they're trying to fill, or whether it's a challenge they perceive, there has to be something, some question or conflict within them that drives them forward. You cannot effectively craft single narrative science fiction without that in a protagonist. I don't care what things you're going to mention. I don't care, well, what about this book and what about that? I'm not here to play those games. I'm here to straight up tell you that the very, very hyper-memorable science fiction protagonists you're thinking of are all characters driven because they've tried to sate a need. Have I made that clear enough? Have I emphasized that point to death? Because we're going to build on it from here. So we've got this character who's trying to sate a need. And the absence of that satiation, that absence of contentment, is establishing their starting state at the beginning of the book. You have to set up the fact that this is how they are. They're just a simple farmer. They long for a life in the stars. They're just somebody who bucks the rules at Starfleet. They're just the disenfranchised son of a nobleman who has strange dreams of a whispering woman and David Bowie. They're loads of whatevers. You've got to establish that character in a starting position, in a starting state. That's your technical term. And from that character development point, you have to start thinking about what their arc is going to be. I know, we haven't built the rest of the story triangle yet. I know. I hear you. I hear you. But you got to think about that arc, because that arc is going to carry the character further and further along in the book. More so than in fantasy. Science fiction's arcs, particularly its protagonistic arcs, meaning the arcs for its main characters, are critical because of the thing that science fiction does that fantasy doesn't do. Science fiction's job is to make the fantastic realistic. I will say that again. Science fiction's job is to make the fantastic realistic. It doesn't matter if we're going a million years in the future or whether we're just doing next Tuesday with some new shit. It doesn't matter if we're making updates or if we're in a different galaxy or whatever. And we're going to talk more about this when we talk about world building and stuff. But by and large, science fiction's whole engine turns on the idea that we've got to make the fantastic into the realistic. And one of the ways we do that is we start realistic and stretch it to the fantastic when it comes to a character arc. Because everybody, you, me, the person over there, the person over there, the person over there, everybody has wants and needs and longings and wishings and hatreds and envies and sadnesses and happinesses and thrills and everything else. And those are the things that motivate us. Those are the realistic things. Now, when we stretch that out and we add extra bells and whistles to it, we can turn that very simple thing into a science fiction story pretty quickly. If I'm just a kid who's really good at a video game in my trailer park, and certain things line up in a certain way, all of a sudden, the thing I'm doing in my trailer park video game all of a sudden becomes true when I become the last starfighter. Or I'm just a very simple farmer on a desert planet who gets pulled into a giant space fascist terrorist fight, and I have to fly my space biplane. But we'll talk about that later. The important thing here is that the arc is the heart of your story. More than your plot, more than your world building. Your character's arc matters. Now, if you're sitting there going, but I want to write a series. I want to have a lot of books. I want to tell a long-ass fucking thing with like 4 different books. Or 7, or 12, or 2, or 3, or 90. Who cares? You're not excused from the idea of needing an arc. It's that this arc covers maybe, and to be fair, if you're new at this, ideally, just this book. You want to try and avoid the tendency, especially in new writers, to take a single arc and stretch it across multiple books. Because that's, and I don't know how else to put this. It's sort of like trying to squeeze into those pants that you know you can't fit in, but you just don't want to admit that you can't fit into them. And the fabric gets stretched real, like nearly translucent, and it's very uncomfortable, but you really just don't want to have that admission that you've just smooshed yourself into these unfitting pants. You know what I'm talking about? That's kind of what we're talking about here. When you stretch that arc too thin, those are some uncomfortable pants. Now, I'm not a fan of pants. I'm on record in multiple platforms, in multiple media, talking about how we would all do better if we just gave up pants. But I think you understand my metaphor. Your character's arc is everything. And your character, we talked about this when we talked about fantasy, is going to be built in the regular set of ways. You're going to give them skills. You're going to give them wants and fears. You're going to give them a moral code to bounce those things off of. You're going to give them abilities. You're going to give them talents, all that stuff. So they feel like a regular person, so that they feel like, to some degree, they're a being a reader can relate to. Whether they're just a kid living on a planet in a galaxy far, far away, whether they're a kid living in a trailer park, whether they're a very old person looking back on their life, whether they're a starship captain, whether they're somebody trapped in time and there's monkeys everywhere. Whatever. You've got to have some elements of that character's composition before we even get to plot, before we even get to the activities, before we even get to what happens in chapter 3. You got to have some of those base elements that a reader can relate to, because they're going to stick with this character. Presumably, they're going to stick with this character for the duration of the story. So why not build that good foundation? We start with our character, we build our character, we start with their arc. That arc is important. Now, it should also be said that it's not necessarily a bad idea if that character arc, that attempt to kind of scratch that itch and fill that void and grow and change as a person, it's not a bad idea if that in some way dovetails with the plot. Yes, it could be the plot itself. Nothing wrong with that. We're going to talk more about that when we start talking about how to shape the story overall. But you generally, it's a nice, safe bet, especially when you're new at this, or you're not really sure you're a great science fiction author yet, or you're kind of stepping into a new genre, or you're just trying to work out and figure out how best to communicate. it's often a really good idea to make a distinction between your character arc and your plot. Now, we're going to talk about plot in a second, but it's worth pointing out that it's not a bad strategy. It doesn't mark you as an amateur. It doesn't mean you suck. It doesn't make you new. You don't have to be this cool to ride the ride. It's just an option to separate your character arc and how they're doing whatever it is they're doing from the main plot. Sometimes for some people, because they're picking one arc that's too big or a plot that's too big, it's really hard for them to sort of connect the two dots barely, or they go the other way and they over-entangle it, they over-entwine the things because they're just not making enough decisions in terms of what it is that they're trying to say. They just want to do everything. They want to have this plot, and they want it to be complicated. They want it to be all this stuff. And whether they think they need it to go that way or they just want to get it that way, but they don't know how, whatever the fact remains is it's all right if it is, and it's all right if it isn't distinct from one another. For the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to tell you that making it separate is better because it's going to give us more granular control over all the parts of everything. If you're somebody who's like, nah, man, I got it all mixed together, understand that you're still going to use the same tools. You just might have to do a little bit more work. Okay? So now, we've got 1/3 of our story triangle built. We've got this character, we've got this arc, we've got this potential person, being, whatever, going to do this thing, going to solve this question, going to deal with this problem. Now, in fantasy, last week, or 2 weeks ago, previously on episode 1, the next thing we built was plot, because we wanted to put the story and give it some momentum. But now, in science fiction, we're going to go the other way. I want to build the world part second. Why? Well, more so than in fantasy, although I know fantasy authors are going to jump on me and tell me that, oh no, John, you are mistaken. But I honestly think, more so in science fiction, the world building matters more than it does for the world building in fantasy. Because so often, fantasy novels tend to fall to defaults, right? They're going to fall into some sort of category like, oh, it's my D&D campaign, so it's got this sort of medieval vibe going on. Or it's, this sort of urban fantasy where it's not quite Shadowrun, but it's not quite like the Dark Crystal, and or it's kind of the Dresden Files, and it's just kind of like, it's a city, but oh, by the way, there's like, goblins and shit at 7-Eleven. And fantasy tends to fall into those tropes much the same way science fiction tends to fall into the big giant tropes. I'm going to talk about those later. But fantasy tends to get pigeonholed more by world construction than science fiction does. Science fiction, because it can be, I think, much bigger than fantasy in terms of scope and scale and potential and type, you get a little bit more flexibility. So let's build a world first with science fiction. As I talked about earlier, you want to make the fantastic into the realistic. And the first sort of rule, the thing you want to carve in stone, is that all the fantastic stuff is only fantastic to the reader, and it's pretty straightforward, if not normal or blasé, to the character. Let's give you an example. All right, so Star Trek. Everybody's totally cool with beaming down to the planet's surface. People in Starfleet don't think twice. It's just like, yeah, we got to beam down. We don't stop and marvel about it. Same thing, we don't stop and marvel at the warp core. We just know that, oh, yeah, the Enterprise has a warp core. All right, cool. Now, it can get more technical than that. We can turn it into some plot point about it. But by and large, the people on the ship don't really stop and go, oh, holy shit, that's the warp core, dude. Check it out. There's all these different particles smashing together. That's we're not getting real fired up about this thing. We just sort of expect it as part of our lives. For you and me, the readers, that's kind of like getting excited about pens. I mean, yes, on some level, it's fascinating that we've created a device that stores ink, and then when you apply pressure to it, it dispenses that ink. Yeah, totally fascinating, super engaging, can mesmerize plenty of children and probably some aliens from different cultures. But by and large, we don't stop and think twice about pens because to us, it's just part of our world. The fantastical elements, if you're trying to make them realistic or feel not less special, but normalized in the world. Like, yeah, it's a warp core. Yeah, we beam down. Yeah, we live on a spaceship. Yeah, we just wear these jumpsuits. Don't call extra attention to it. It's normal for them. Why would we spend so much time talking about it? Yes, it's new to the reader, and a lot of writers can feel this sort of compulsion, this urge, this drive, this need to sit there and like, well, it might be normal to them, but John, the reader doesn't know. I got to explain how the warp core works. Why? Just why? Right this second, you have to stop and give me like this Wikipedia super encyclopedia description of like antipositronics and different collision matrices and containment fields. I need that right now? Like in the beginning of your goddamn story? Are you trying to put the reader to sleep? There's a real marker, a real signpost for anxious writers, for underdeveloped writers, for writers with a real unfamiliarity with their craft and their voice, to cram, especially the first like 10th of their book, with like a billion fucking details. Like just an obscene, like back a truck up to the door level details. Because you got to know. You got to know all about this and the permacrete and the this and the that and the force fields and the this slider and the this. And they talk about all this stuff on practically like an atomic level if they could. And unless you are trying to write in what is now a very outdated style, say from the 1980s, unless you were directly trying to intentionally ape that style for whatever reason, I don't know, please understand that you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. It's okay to not bottleneck the story with tons of info dump up front. You can instead parcel that stuff out as it needs, as you want to come up, as you want to deploy it to the reader, because this is a good moment to do so. You know, if we're just walking past the warp core because the story's just getting started, that's not the moment to go talk about the warp core. The moment to talk about the warp core is when we're in engineering and we're just not quite starting the story, or we've just started the story, but we're in engineering and we're going to stay there for a little while. And since the warp core is related to engineering, that's a great moment to bring it up. Likewise, if we're dealing with a farm boy and his space wizard granddad, then what we're dealing with is not a moment to talk about, hundreds of other dead space wizards and thousands of years of history. You just make a casual reference to it. And then you bring it up a little bit later, and you bring it up a little bit later, and you bring it up a little bit later, spaced out. Because the reader benefits more from the cumulative effect of knowledge over the course of the whole book, more than sticking all the information up front. Why? Because it's easier to engage with. It's easier to feel like it matters. It's easier to keep track of. If I sat here up front and I gave you 100 facts and gave it to you all in 10 minutes and then just moved on with my day and barely mentioned facts 62 to 72, and then 2 minutes away from the ending of the recording, I was like, hey, remember fact 63? Okay, have a good night, guys. Bye-bye. You'd be hosed. That's the same sort of feeling. That's the same sort of frustration. That's the same kind of idea you're developing with your reader relationship when you're just info dumping up front and then failing to pay off or failing to deliver or failing to develop going forward. It's a very common problem, and it's really fixable by just being a little patient and organizing your information. So when we're building our world, it's all organization. What elements are we going to make definitely fantastic? How you want to do this, because we talked about it, is you go from realistic to fantastic. So realistic is the reader's perspective, how the reader lives, who the reader is, what they're like. Picture them in your head, whomever they might be, however they identify, wherever they are. Picture them right now. And then figure out how many steps in how many different ways you are going to go for your story. So let's suppose your ideal reader is somebody in their mid-20s. They're maybe in college. They're maybe not in college, but they're in their mid-20s. They're young. They enjoy a broad number of things, but they really like slightly edgy stories. But you're going to tell your particularly edgy story about two 20-year-olds in the 31st century on a spaceship. Well, the number of steps away from today to the 31st century is way more than chronological, though that is a factor. You got to talk about starships. You got to talk about life on a starship. You got to talk about why we're on a starship. In what ways is the character's life different? Those are important. We want to keep track of them. But equally important, though different, are the ways it's similar. Because if we're going to create a character from the 31st century, a reader hanging out today, how are they going to relate to things? How are they going to relate to the 31st century? They might be worried they're not going to be able to survive another 10 years. So we can't immediately just go, it's the 31st century, except it's on Earth. Because that's a real dismissive sort of idea. You want to balance, not so much in terms of quantity, but in terms of what's called narrative weight, the idea of how big a deal something is in the story. The ways the reader is going to relate to that character really matter, because the better the relationship the reader has to the character, the more flexibility you as a writer get to create those fantastic things. One of the reasons why we can totally buy into something like Star Wars or Star Trek, which is so outside our normal scope because it's on different planets. There's like Muppets and shit. There's like weird space stuff. There's androids and Klingons. The reason we're able to go to those lengths and say, yeah, that's just how that shit is because there are some elements of the story where we can relate, like humanity or loneliness or a wanting to be important or special. Or we've all felt small and had to grow along the way. Those are really important key elements that allow us to relate because they are at the base of our story building, as opposed to sort of snuck in because you got too excited talking about, holy shit, you guys, there's space wizards. So really make sure you've got that relationship well crafted and the world building helps support it. Because you can go way out. You can get into like hyperdimensionality and like sentient space planets and Orson Welles eating other Transformers and, you know, all different kinds of stuff. And we're willing to go with it. You just go, yeah, that's how that story works, because there's some underlying relatable key human thing underneath it. Not necessarily in a one-to-one order. For every one fantastic thing, there does not have to be one-to-one relatable things. But you want to try and keep some core nest of relatable material together, because that's going to help the reader no matter where you take the story. And when we get into the derivations of the fantastic, remember that they are going to be on some level normalized for the character, especially if it's a thing that's existed in the chronology of the story for a while before the character came around. And especially if the character is not the inventor or progenitor, that's the word I'm looking for, of this new material. Like if we're not telling the story of the first spaceship, the spaceships are just a thing everybody knows. Like, yeah, it's a spaceship. The same way you would go, oh yeah, it's a car. Maybe that's how you want people to consider spaceships in your world. So you want to find the way to make the fantastic into something that can be understood and appreciated. Now, the level of detail you give it in order to make it cool is a completely separate thing. Do not confuse your level of cool detail for relatability. Again, looking at those signposts for underdeveloped writing, you can always spot the writer, always, who has confused, holy shit, I made a cool thing and I can't shut up about it, with, holy shit, this thing is really helping my story develop. There's a big gap. There's a giant Grand Canyon chasm between those two things. Just because it's cool and you like it does not mean it's helping your story. Science fiction is rife with those things. Everybody and their mother wants to make a spaceship. Everybody and their dad has like fanciful dreams of being, the captain of the so and so and the such and such. Okay, sure. But by and large, don't mistake the coolness of something for the relatability and connection it can give you. Because it's only really cool to you unless you are able to translate the image from your head onto the page and put some version of that image in somebody else's head. Otherwise, it's just very excited sort of self-pleasure and sticky making. See what I'm saying? I apparently got a note in my inbox like, hey, you maybe you could consider scaling down some of the more offensive language. Well, first of all, go fuck yourself. I'm going to describe it how I want to describe it. And second of all, fine, you want me to use some euphemistic language? Okay. When you spend an awful lot of time trying to make everybody think about how cool everything is, imagine that you have just sort of spent your time deeply engaged in self-pleasure to the point where at the end of the day, the reader is left unsatisfied and you're the only one pleased. How's that? Does that work? Does that sound familiar? Because that's what you're doing every time you go like 10 miles deep on describing how cool something is, trying to get the reader to buy in when you fail to really give it any connectivity. Our world building furthers that connection, gives it a sense of rules, because there are still going to be rules. We talked about that when we talked about in episode 1, and we've talked about it elsewhere. Your world needs to have rules so that it has boundaries. That does not mean our story sits directly at the boundaries. It just means that there are boundaries and the story operates within them. And when we have to deviate from a rule, it's purposeful in our story. Like all of a sudden we have to have Keanu Reeves realize he has to fight Elrond because everything is digital. And in fact, at the end of the day, it's all about just being a very proud transgender person and accepting that reality. And then you're able to defeat the guy from Lord of the Rings. That kind of storytelling is about relatability more so than, okay, so what happens is like the phone turns you into like a digital thing, and then the plug in the back of your brain does CGI stuff, and then poof, we're just us. Put the focus in your story, in your world building, on the things you want the reader to relate to. And then once they buy in, because you will have clearly described it as opposed to bludgeon them about the head and neck with it, once you have clearly described a thing, they'll go with you wherever you want to take them. If you suddenly want to invent like weird digital French people in the sequel to your book, and then all of a sudden like, how did I call it on Patreon? Orgasm cake. And then the story takes like this weird turn because it turns into like digital cyber Jesus. Yeah, sure. They'll buy in because they invested early and you're just perpetuating that. And that's all from the world building because it's the setup of our story. It's the foundation. Our character has a want and the world building facilitates making that want achievable. Might be difficult, should be difficult by all accounts. But it's important that we attempt this as a character. And honestly, the more difficult it is, the more satisfied we will be when we achieve it. So we want a slightly difficult task before our protagonist. Notice that I have not mentioned antagonists until now. We're going to touch on this real briefly, and then we're going to move to plot. Actually, it's going to be our segue to plot. There is not so much in science fiction, this is more for fantasy. There's a real bad habit, especially in messier, indecisive manuscripts, to try and make your antagonist sympathetic. And I'm going to kill the music just for a second so that you can clearly understand that this is a colossally not great idea. You do not have to make your antagonist sympathetic. Every time you try and do this, you ruin, at the very least you erode, but you most definitely ruin the relationship you have between your reader and your protagonist. Because the whole point of following the protagonist and wanting them to achieve their goal is because you want to see them overcome the obstacle or obstacles standing in their way. The antagonist is an obstacle standing in the way of the protagonist. So if we make the antagonist sympathetic or understandable, and I understand that there's a great deal of humor or like dork irony to be, wrung out of the idea that Thanos was right, or whatever horse shit you want to get into. The more gray area you sit in with your antagonist and protagonist, the more you scatter that relationship. Because if I really like the antagonist, I don't maybe want the protagonist to succeed. Then why do I care so much about the book? Because I just like the antagonist just as much. It doesn't really, I don't root against them. It's just kind of like, oh my God, what do I do? That indecision that you're putting the reader in does not help them say like, oh, this was a really good book. Because writing is the act of making decisions. And your insistence on not making a decision in terms of, look, reader, I want you to side with this character versus that character, is complicating everything. Just, it's okay to side with the protagonist. It's okay to side with the protagonist. Okay, back to the music, back to antagonists. Just so we're clear, because somebody asked me this, I think in the YouTube comments. An antagonist is an oppositional character opposed to the protagonist who we can personify. We can turn them into a being or a thing that we can directly fight against. It doesn't necessarily have to be a human. It can be an AI. It can be an alien. It could be a this. It could be a 90s leathery space vampire. It could be a whatever. It's just got to be a thing we can directly oppose. That's different than an antagonistic force where we don't have a direct antagonist. So when Matt Damon gets marooned on Mars, there's an antagonistic force driving his survival. Will he survive on Mars? Now, there's no Martian attacking Matt Damon trying to directly kill him. So there's no antagonist in The Martian, but there is an antagonistic force compelling Matt Damon to try and survive. He's got to grow poop potatoes in order to live, and then he's got to go drive the thing around. So this is an antagonistic force. Generally, the vast majority of science fiction stories do way better with an antagonist because you get way more flexibility and there's way more creative space and you can do a lot more with them. It's okay to have an antagonistic force, but they're going to boil down to some pretty straightforward concepts like survival or starvation or deprivation or loss. Big, broad concepts. And once you start to personify that force to any degree, you've made an antagonist. And it can be really tricky to try and do both and get them to balance out. So for the vast majority of people checking this out, just go with the antagonist. It's going to be fine. I swear to you, it's going to be fine. So our antagonist, we don't want them sympathetic necessarily, but we want them working on the plot. And here's how we tie our whole story triangle together. The plot. Plot, as we've talked about in four videos? This, episode 1, the one entirely on plot, and at least several of the chats. Plot is conflict. Plot is a challenge. Plot is multiple people, at least two, at odds with one another trying to resolve a thing in their favor. I need to rule the galaxy. You want to rule the galaxy. Or you want to stop me from ruling the galaxy. We both need to control the big giant space aspirin. I want vengeance against you the same way that you hate me. We have some kind of conflict, some kind of tension between two sides. Yes, you can always bring in more people. We're going to talk about multiple point of view approaches in a second. But by and large, there's tension. One of the big things that leads to an awful lot of rejection in science fiction is that, remember how we talked about you don't want to saturate the whole reader and, oh my God, look at this cool thing, look at this cool thing, look at this cool thing, look at that cool thing. Hey, what about that? What about that? What about this? What about that? What about that? One of the reasons you don't want to bottleneck all that up is because if you do that in the first 10 pages, there's no real sense of movement in the story. You don't get anywhere. It's just kind of, like I gotta read all this before we get to the good stuff. Now, it might be cool on its own. It might be really neat how you talked about space laser spoons or something. But there's an expectation, especially in traditional publishing, that when the book is open and we get into those opening pages, there's something to attach to beyond just that extra, I'm going to use the word, masturbatory urge you had to just describe things that you thought were really cool. It really does bug me, that whole comment about how, you do a lot better if you were less offensive. If you've ever had an actual conversation with me, this is me toned down. There's way more cursing normally. You can find me on Discord and, oh boy, or Patreon. I do a lot more cursing on Patreon. Anyway, moving on. When we build our plot, our antagonist is the one doing the plot. They don't have a whole lot else to do. They're just here for the plot. And they can start that plot or have been on that plot long before the protagonist gets on board. That's okay. It's okay. They don't have to start the race at the same time. Now, there is a great deal of debate, valid debate, as to what you want to start the story with. Do I want to start with the protagonist? Do I want to start with world building? Do I want to start with the plot? Hell, do I even want to start with the antagonist? There's all very valid arguments as to what goes first. They are all going to lead to overall a different approach to a story. Starting with world building is going to set up a story differently than if you started with the main character. But in the end, you're going to get ideally where you're going to go. You're going to take a different route depending on where you start. If you're unsure to any degree, start with something the reader can relate to. Whether that's an action scene, whether that's dialogue, whether that's a character, whether that's a moment, whether that's a big-ass ship flying in front of a desert, who knows what. Find something the reader can relate to so that they can invest, so that they can say, yeah, I want more information, please, and they'll keep reading. Whatever that might be, that's up to you depending on what you're writing. Our plot is a conflict that's going to have multiple steps involved. One of the other things that leads to, fast train to Rejectionville is a really simple plot that doesn't get enough developmental space. It doesn't bloom over the course of the story. It's just like 3 scenes, but they're so radically spread apart. The writer's just kind of like, well, I have 3 scenes. I have 3 plot beats. Like, that should be enough, right? But they're not really connected. They're just 3 things that occur. Just because they occur around similar things does not make them a plot, because they're missing that connective tissue. That connective tissue being, one, more than just the bare minimum number of things to do about the conflict of the plot, but also, and this is really critical for science fiction, even more so than fantasy, is theme. Your theme in science fiction should be like super 5-star, big, giant, like major deal. I'm trying to find a superlative way of describing it. If you don't have a theme in science fiction, you will suffer and struggle to publish, or if you're going to self-publish it thinking you're just going to end around the system, you will have a hard-ass time trying to build an audience. Theme really matters in science fiction, more so than fantasy. Probably more so than anything outside of like children's books. Theme is top of the mountain when it comes to science fiction, because it's the theme that's going to help reinforce all the relatable elements. It's not going to be the fact that it happens to the same character. It's not going to be the fact that that all the characters are roughly the same age, or that they're all just kind of cool people doing cool people stuff. It's the fact that the theme ties a lot of this stuff together. And if you're unsure what a theme is, here's a theme. It is a lesson. It is an idea. It is a philosophy. It is a thought. It is a summation of something in the story that the reader can take away from the story and use as a reference point in their own life. Maybe it's learning to stand up to a bully, or learning to deal with obsession, or learning to come to terms with the fact that, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or you have to accept your identity as, you're the guy from Bill and Ted and John Wick, but you also happen to be an allegory for a trans person. Whatever it might be, your theme holds your story together. And if you really want to make this nice neat package and really boost your writing tremendously, tie your theme more directly to your arc. Because normally a character arc contains smidges, soupçon of themes. But if we want to make that more indivisible, yeah, it might mean you got to make the arc a little less complicated. Do not make things complicated just because you think complicated is going to help you stand out. Because I'm going to tell you this, just as a note, you are not the first person to think that I should be complicated where everybody else is being simple. You are not the first person to have that brainstorm. Loads of people are going to try to make things 10 times more complicated than you. Don't lean on complication. Lean on relatability. So our theme ties to our arc. Now, our arc does not have to be the plot. We've talked about that. But it helps if that arc kind of intersects or bounces into the plot here and there. How many times? I don't know. It depends on what everything is. But you don't necessarily want it to be two very divergent things. The more divergent, the more separate, the more totally unrelated the character arc is from the plot arc, the more the reader's going to feel like, well, one just came to a screeching halt, and now we're going to pick up the other one. And there's always going to be that sense of what happened to the story? We were just talking about this one thing. Now everything has just slammed on the brakes and, I guess we're doing a new thing now. You want to mitigate some of that. You want to counterbalance. You want to actually make it not do that. So you develop the arc and the themes to somehow bounce into the plot. For example, let's suppose you've got a story and a plot about space fascists, and they are trying to rule the galaxy using a big giant new superweapon. Meanwhile, you've got this character who's a young farm boy, or a young, let's not even make it gendered, a young person on a farm who dreams of having a better, more ambitious life, who is not content to just stand where they are. They're always looking up to the stars. They're always looking away. They're always waiting for an adventure. And because of the way just events turn in the story, the group of people fighting against the space fascists kind of get caught up with the kid on the farm. But the kid on the farm's arc is about becoming a hero and getting away from, just their place on the farm and the small outskirts, and getting more involved and growing into something better. So their arc has to deal with them being or discovering that they're a space wizard. And that space wizard, it doesn't directly stop the fascists in space, but it does enable the stopping of space fascists. So that's how we bring our arc back to our plot. When those things fuse back together, the story feels more complete and more satisfying. If you don't want to go with that example, let's suppose we are the captain of a starship who doesn't entirely follow all the rules. And a long time ago, we dealt with our most dangerous foe by marooning them on some rock and left them to die. But now, years later, we have found that villain has survived, and they're on a vengeance mission to harm us the way we harmed them, and it costs us everything we care about. And it sets into motion a number of deaths and a number of losses and a number of very damaging things that will forever change our life. Our personal arc is to deal with the obsession we had and our anger and our loss and the futility and the self-sacrifice of having an enemy and doing whatever we feel we need to do in order to defeat them. Even though the overall plot is, hey, I guess we better like make sure that the stuff we're supposed to do goes off without a hitch, but it's not because this villain has come in and intercepted it. Tie your arc and your theme into your overall plot in places rather than make them indivisible, and you will have a more effective base for storytelling. That's our story triangle. That's the first sort of third or so of what we're going to talk about tonight. That's how we set up our story. Now, what your pieces might be individual to your work, that's up to you. What your character does, who they are, how many planets we're dealing with, all that stuff. So before we move into the actual drafting part, I do want to touch on a few points that I didn't quite have any other place to put when I was laying this out. Chronology doesn't matter. You can have star dates. It can be a galaxy a long time ago, far, far away. It can be 300 years from now. It could be 10 years from now, if we want to do like a dystopic kind of thing. Chronology ultimately doesn't matter. You can establish it however you want, and the reader will just roll with it. It's fine. It's fine, really. Because how many times have we really thought about Star Trek's Stardate system beyond like, oh, it's just something the captain says in voiceover, and then we move on? I mean, Stardates don't even match. If you go to the wikis and you start reading around, Stardates don't match. Stardates were just there from the writers to try to hodgepodge things, and they later tried to shoehorn it all in order to have things make sense. Star Wars, by the way, isn't much better, since the entire timeline for Star Wars is measured in terms of distance to the one battle at the end of the first movie. That's not actually how time is normally measured, but everything is either before or after the Battle of Yavin. So time is fairly irrelevant. Don't get hung up on it. It's less critical than you think. Now, if you're using a story where time is the stakes, right, where we have to like only have 30 hours to do a thing, that's a different persuasion of time. That's a different flavor of story. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just setting up the world building. That time is fairly irrelevant. Don't overthink it. Just get it down there. Second thing. Let's talk about the MPOV single point of view thing. I don't know if you know this, but there have been a lot of old white dudes, especially in the science fiction territory, who have popularized a really bad habit that science fiction needs to be epic. It needs to be this big, tremendous thing. And it doesn't. It can be. Loads of things can be. But it doesn't have to be. Also, you're not going to be the first person to think of, I'm going to do Game of Thrones in space. You're not the first person to think of that. You're not even the first person to think about that in the last 10 minutes. It doesn't need to be this big, huge thing. If you're going to do it, or you've already started it, I'm counting on my fingers. Let's go with 2 major pieces of advice. 1, all of these rules apply. Plot, world building, theme, all that stuff. And 2, some characters are just going to be cooler and better than others, and that doesn't make them protagonists. Sometimes your cool characters are secondary characters, and you just have to deal with it. Not every cool person needs to be a point of view character. There should probably be, I should probably like do a whole like hour, maybe on Thursday this week, I'll do a whole hour on like just straight up how to unfuck multiple point of view, because it irritates me. Yeah, for now, let's put that on the list. Okay, so other point. Where's my notes? Linus is sitting on my notes. Okay, here we go. If MPOV isn't so critical, the other major problem with MPOV is that it diffuses a relatability, right? If I have to follow 15 characters, I have to take that same amount of attachment I would have for one and divide it into 15 pieces. It's going to be an unequal split. You probably don't want me to have an unequal split because you've got so much story and so much plot going on that you don't want me focused in any other way other than how you intended. But you made this bed and now I'm lying in it and now you're mad about it. You don't have to spread everything out so large. You don't have to talk about, like literally all the things everywhere all the time in every plot. Things can be smaller. Sometimes instead of the whole universe being at risk, sometimes it's just Digital Moriarty fighting Geordi and Data in the holodeck. Sometimes it's just the story of, somebody wants to open up a new restaurant in space. Sometimes it's just the story of two small, people trying to make their way in pod racing. It's okay if the story is small. When we talk about scope and scale, maybe that should be our segue. When we talk about scope and scale, you're not automatically limited. I think it's the best way to put it. You don't have to write big, giant epic. You don't. The word count range for science fiction is the biggest period in any genre. 79,000 to about 265,000 words. That's your range for science fiction. Now, granted, when we get into the upper triple digits, you're talking about what's called major epic science fiction. It's not traditionally published so much anymore, but it's out there. It exists. But it's a huge it's a huge word count range. In no way, shape, or form does everything have to fall into the 100 to 115,000 word. There's a whole ocean of word counts. Please don't feel like you've got to fall into this one limited window in order to be publishable. Because I'm going to tell you, publishable science fiction is science fiction that makes the fantastic realistic and the reader can relate to it. And everything else is a bell or a whistle. So whether we're talking about billionaires making, Paul Bettany-powered robot suits, or whether we're talking about people on starships fighting robot people, or whether we're talking about kids with space wizards and biplanes, or whether we're talking about, weird Timothy Chalamet, hazy spice dreams, doesn't matter. Can we relate to it in some way? That is our big, giant, put a stamp on it, kind of moment for this. We need that relationship. Now we're going to talk about drafting. Because if we want this relationship, we got to put it on the page. And as I said with the first episode, I'm going to repeat it here. You have to put it on the page. Your job is to create a mental movie for the reader. If you don't write it down how you see it in your head, the reader isn't going to know to see it that way in their head. We are many things. We are not mind readers. So don't skimp on things because you think, oh, they'll get it. There's a time and a place to not detail everything. Remember we talked about how you don't want to detail everything out to the subatomic level? No one gives a shit about the fibers of the space carpet. But you still want to describe the carpet as being there. There are two real common pitfalls. You see it a lot in science fiction manuscripts. One we've talked about already. That there is so much detail for everything, everywhere, every time, that you don't really know how to parse your way through. It's just so detail dense. And there's a real feeling that comes from that the story's just kind of buried. It's here, it's got to be here somewhere, but there's paragraph upon paragraph of everything in the way. I got to clear out all this clutter before I can find the story. Or the other end of things, where there's very, very, very little detail. It's practically skeletal. And it's often done because the writer doesn't want to over detail things, so they pull back, but they way over course correct. They yank this whole thing out. And the next thing you know, they've barely got any details, so you don't really know what to picture. Now, they know if you were to ask them, they could totally explain it to you. But one of the upsides about being a writer is that you don't have to simultaneously be in everybody's house to read over their shoulder and go, okay, the thing I'm talking about here on page 22 is that I want you to picture this particular thing, and then they go to describe it. If you just put that on the page instead, you won't have to try and do that. The reader comes to your book because they want a story. They want a movie in their head. Your responsibility is to put the movie in their head, which means you need to translate the image in your head into words so that it can put the image or something like it in somebody else's head. When we draft science fiction, it is to your advantage to get it all out, to vomit it on the page, to just go way overboard. Like, if you're worried that you're writing too many words, just keep going. Just write it all out. Science fiction is one of the few genres, romance being the other one, where it is sometimes helpful to find the story in the edit more often than anywhere else. That makes it different than fantasy, where fantasy often benefits because of the number of, the lack of boundaries, the lack of reality to things, because we can just make up another planet with another kingdom and dragons and wizards and shit. Whereas science fiction, we're at least sort of bounded a little bit by some kind of relatable content. So we have this ability to relate in different ways. So in drafting then revising, it's to our advantage because you're going to have more detail. When we're writing, get it all out. Don't judge it. Don't judge it. Do not judge it. When you are in the act of drafting, do not judge it. Why? Because you're writing it down. It's not done yet. You're not done yet. Every sentence needs friends. Your job is to just give the next sentence more friends. It's not done yet, so how can you yell about it sucks? It's not done yet. If I'm building a house and I put together a few beams and I lay out where the staircase is, I can't complain about the second floor bathroom not being the right shape. I haven't even made it yet. So what you want to do, especially for science fiction, is get in the habit of just putting the story out, knowing that you're going to write multiple drafts, knowing that it just doesn't matter how many drafts, knowing that no one gives a shit how many drafts. Well, no, that's not true. You know who gives a shit about the number of drafts? The #writing community. Why? Because out there, everybody's got some genitals to measure. Everybody needs to know exactly just where they rank and how they fit in with everybody else. Because as we have talked about before, the #writing community doesn't give a fuck about your writing. They don't even really care about community. It's just a giant urination contest. It's just not what you're looking for. So don't try and make it into something it just cannot fundamentally be. Write as many drafts as you need. Do as much as you need to do. Get it out there. So let's assume we're using 3-act structure. Where do we put things? How do we organize things? Well, we talked about earlier how there's an option. Do we start with the plot? Do we start with world building? Do we start with a character? Do we start with, the antagonist even? All of them are valid. Just know that some are might be, especially if you're newer at this, if you're nervous, if you're not really having a real strong, clear opinion of this is how I want to sound, chances are some starts are going to get you slower out of the gate than others. For instance, you are frequently more likely to have a harder time picking up speed and engaging in the story if you start with world building, because world building is often perceived to be dry, kind of slow, kind of dull, because it's just fact. There's this and this, and you're just detailing things. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not bad. You need to do it, but understand that if you start there, you're going to have to work harder to pick up momentum going forward. Now, for some writers, that's no problem whatsoever because they know when they do start gaining momentum, they're off to the races. And that's fine. Some people, decide they don't want to deal with that and they start with the character because they want to build that relationship and grab things and they'll roll things forward. Now, the downside there with starting with a writer is that you might struggle to develop the world building because we attach to the character and we attach to what they want so much. So some of the world building details gets lost along the way. And then when we do get it into the story, it feels forced or it feels underdeveloped or it feels kind of like it's a passing comment and we don't mean it to be. The other approach, we start with the antagonist. We make the bad guy sound real bad. He comes barging through the 1970s spaceship. And then we kind of know like, oh shit, this is real bad. That's fine, except there's going to be that hard transition when we have to move away from the antagonist to do something like the protagonist or the rest of the story or the other world building. So there's always going to be an upside and a downside to whatever your choice is. There is no one super clear-cut perfect formula. Just commit to one of the starts. Start with world building, start with a character, start with plot, start with the antagonist, start with something. Commit to it, and then keep the story going forward. If I start with the antagonist, okay, I'm setting the stage for, we know at some point we're going to have conflict with this person. Okay, cool. Once I introduce that, maybe I want to bring in the other side. Maybe that's when I jump to the protagonist. Or maybe not. Maybe it's because we start with the antagonist because we want to get the plot rolling. That's fine too. Maybe we set up the antagonist because we're going to develop the world because we're going to montage the antagonist's battle across multiple star systems. Who knows? Just pick one thing and go with it. You can always make another draft. You can always try a different opening. Yeah, that means you're going to have to rewrite some stuff. I'm sorry, you're a writer. You signed up for the writing. No one is expecting you to do this in 2 drafts and be done. Nobody. You don't need to do it that way. That's not how this works. You don't get bonus points for doing a fewer number of drafts than somebody else. You don't get more money for doing it faster. You don't get anything. Maybe a few, oh, that was nice, or oh, okay, sure. But they're short-lived. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Do the best you can. If it takes you 4 drafts, it takes you 4 drafts. Who gives a shit? Just do your best. In the first act, whatever we commit to, we develop until we get to plot. That's always been the way we've described things, right? But this now we're going to add a little wrinkle because we're this series builds in layers. So if we start with plot, does that mean the first act is only 2 paragraphs? Yes and no. And I know that's a shitty answer, but hang with me. I see you running for the door. Hang with me. Yes and no. Because, yeah, if we want to push our glasses up our nose and go hang out with the academic dorks, they'll totally tell you that the minute you started with the plot, your first act was however many sentences it took you to start the plot. Or that you just jumped right into second act because you started your first sentence with plot. There's always going to be some dork who's going to go that way. I went to school with a lot of them. They were annoying then. Imagine how they're annoying 20 years from now. Yeah, that's a shitty thing. But the counter to that is, how much plot did you give? If we're looking at Star Wars, for example, part of the plot is Princess Leia given the plans to R2-D2. Does that mean that from that moment when they jettison off the ship and they crash on Tatooine, that's Act 2? No. Act 2 doesn't start until Luke turns to Obi-Wan and goes, yeah, let's go hang out with Harrison Ford. That's Act 2. Why? Because, yeah, we did talk about plot, but to what degree? What else have we got? What else are we doing? Don't get overly hung up on the rigidity that applies to some genres more than others. If you started with plot, that's fine. What matters is once you started there, how did you develop? How did we move forward? How did you mitigate the upcoming hard gap when all of a sudden you have to transition to talk about something else? You got to be willing to map that out. Think about it. Plan for it. Know that it's coming. Okay, I'm going to start with plot, which means I'm going to have to overcome the obstacle. And how am I going to go from talking about the plot to talking about the world building? Okay, well, maybe at the end of that scene, I can segue a little bit easier. You can think about things in these terms, not just, well, this scene feeds to that scene, feeds to this scene, feeds to... That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I also want you thinking beyond that. I want you to see that these permutations of story can be developed and attached and fixed in loads of different ways. If it works for you to think about scenes in just chronological successive order, this A, B, C, D, E, F, fine. Good for you. If it works, let's do it. Let's do it until we're done. That's great. It does not make you less of an author or less good than somebody who comes along and goes, I'm attaching it this way because I want to segue into this because I have this idea. It's just a different way to do it. Yes, there are going to be people who talk into microphones, who actually put their whole face in color on newsletter headers, who want to tell you all about how wrong that is. And they can go kick rocks and eat mayonnaise because it just doesn't matter. It's not worth fighting about. Whatever you do in the course of your early draft, just go with it. And our first draft develops to a certain point with a certain amount of plot. How much is up to you? Certain amount of plot to move us forward. The second act, just like in fantasy, is where our story really picks up everything. It's going to pick up more plot stuff. It's going to pick up more pacing. It's going to pick up more detail. It's going to pick up more adventure. It's going to pick up more risk. It's going to pick up more theme. It's going to pick up, you name it, it's picking it up. There's a reason why the second act is a real big act in science fiction fantasy, because it's where the bulk of the story happens. Now, I'm only looking at 3-act structure. You want to talk 5-act structure, we'll just imagine I'm talking about, Act 2 and Act 3, because that's the difference, really. But what we have so far here is a story that is mostly in Act 2. And it is not necessarily a bad idea to just start your writing in Act 2 and go, I'll deal with Act 1 later. No one said you had to write this thing in order. Yeah, ultimately later when you go to publish it, however you choose to do that, it needs to be in order, but we're just writing. We're just writing. We're just writing. So our development in Act 2 is the bulk of our story. Leave yourself a breadcrumb trail. You can fill in the gaps later. Nothing wrong with that. Who's going to know? Who's going to know? I mean, even if you want to tell everybody, it's fine. You're not going to lose points or something. But we build up and we build up in Act 2 all the way to our climax. And more so than in fantasy, a climax in science fiction is a big deal because of how fantastic we've made the stuff in our story. We have to definitely make sure we've preserved the relatability, because 9 times out of 10, the stuff that's going to make the climax so neat and whiz-bang cool is the extra stuff we don't have in real life. The reason why we care about Patrick Stewart fighting, making air quotes, fighting F. Murray Abraham is because they're doing it in a weird space future hallway. The reason why we care about, Alec Guinness fighting David Prowse with some laser sticks is because it's momentous. And it's relatable because it speaks to theme and it speaks to, the idea of this old guy fighting this big dangerous dude and who knows how it's going to happen, and it's out of our hands to some degree. You want to preserve, not so much preserve in terms of don't use until, but make sure you keep around this idea of relatability for your climax. And the climax, as we talked about before and as we've talked about elsewhere, is the inevitable intersection of protagonist with antagonist. Now, if you have, for whatever reason, multiple antagonists, I guess because you think that's going to help your story, you want to assign what's called priority to them. Figure out which one is the most bad, save them for last, and then in sort of video game level order, work your way up from them. There's nothing wrong with that, but just know that just like when we had more protagonists, we're sort of splitting our reader relationship. The more antagonists, we're sort of splitting our attention in terms of stakes. Well, if I fight that guy, how is fighting that guy different than fighting that guy? I got guy A, and I got to fight guy B. If guy B is supposed to be more dangerous or more powerful than guy A, why don't I just skip A and fight B? These are the sort of story structure questions that you should poke your story with a stick about. It does make a difference. That's why we don't generally want to have so many moving parts, and instead make those parts that do move the best they can be, rather than just throwing more moving parts in. Extra complexity does not necessarily make for automatically a better author or a better reception. We have our climax, the tipping point of our story, where all of a sudden everything shifts and moves, and we can move into our third act, resolution. Well, what happens in resolution? Much like in fantasy, our science fiction resolution is pretty steep because it's pretty abrupt. We all walk down a hallway and everybody but the Wookiee gets a medal. And we all celebrate at the end when we blow shit up. Or, Spock is dead and we cry about it, but in the end we play some bagpipes and we go out, we go have a burger. Our resolution is abrupt because we want the climax to have more meaning. If we drag ass and just take forever and a day to wrap everything up, it feels like that ending in Return of the King where there's like 5 endings and the screen goes dark and you get ready to get out of your seat and oh shit, it's another like 3 minutes and oh, we're dark again. Nope, another 10 minutes. And we just drag it out and drag it out and drag it out. You can avoid that by just clearly packaging these things up as one resolution. That's 3-act structure. Now, how many drafts it takes you to do that? That's up to you. There's a lot of different factors that go into that. Sentence structure, paragraph structure, chapter size, story complexity, the strength of your voice, the clarity of your descriptions, the size of your story, a million different factors. But let's say, on average, you get it done in the average amount of time, so 3 drafts. Now you want to publish this thing. All right. If you are convinced, just utterly rock solidly convinced, that you want to traditionally publish this, I know there's a paper shortage. I know there's a cardboard shortage. I know that you will be horrendously damaging the environment by demanding your book gets shipped across the planet in a big-ass boat. But whatever, you got to have what you got to want, right? Because that's capitalism. So you're going to print a physical copy. And if you want that to happen in the most traditional of ways, you're going to need to go find a pimp, an agent, which means you're going to query. So how do you query effective science fiction? Well, okay. Here's how you do it. You want to... Hang on a minute. I'm blinking. Why am I blinking? I don't know. It's blinking. So, okay. You have this setup where it's still... Sorry, the blinking was distracting me. It's just blinking. Whatever. Okay. You have this setup where you've got to have 3 definite things. 3 things you most definitely need. Ready? 1, a point of appeal. 2, a fantastic element. 3, a situation or stakes. Those 3 things make science fiction queries interesting. Let's go through them. A point of appeal. How can we relate to this story? Okay? How can we relate to this story? Do we want to relate to it through the world building? Do we want to relate to it through the character? Do we want to talk about it in some way, shape, or form where we have something somewhere in some part of the text where we can figure pieces out? What's our point of appeal? That's going to take pretty much front and center stage, at least at the early part of our query letter, because we're trying to hook people's attention. Much like how we had relatability for our character and the early part of our story, we've got the same thing here in our query. What's next? Something fantastic. Now, this is where you get to sort of put a spotlight on your cool shit. We do it here so that it can be chosen out of all the, all the fish at the fish market. What's your cool thing? What's a cool thing? What's a cool thing that relates to that point of appeal you brought up before? Don't mention two disparate things. It's going to feel really janky. It's going to feel really messy, like you just slapped this thing together. I don't want that for you. What I want you instead is to have sort of a cohesive unit. So, what's a fantastic element that works in and around or in the favor of or helps to complement in some way, shape, or form your point of appeal? Is it the world building because it speaks to your character's goal or hope or dream or arc? Maybe. I don't know. Let's assume for the sake of argument that it is. Great. So far, so good. We're 2/3 of the way through. What's the last part? Well, we've got to tie this together, which means we're going to need to talk about stakes. Why should the reader, the future pimp of your book, the future, money withholder, door alleged opener, etc., why should they care? So you've given me this cool character, you've given me this cool thing that relates to them. What are they supposed to do with it in the story? Why does that matter? Why should I give a shit? Why should I keep reading? What are the stakes? What happens if the farm boy doesn't stop space fascism? What happens if, the intrepid captain doesn't get to captain a starship? What happens if Timothée Chalamet doesn't meet Zendaya? It's Zendaya, right? Pretty sure it is. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is. But what happens if those people don't meet? What happens if, Oscar Isaac and his sweet beard don't show up? Like, why should I care? How do we make this matter? How do we make this work? So, what we want and what we need to do is package those things together in some order, not necessarily in 1, 2, 3 order, but in some order to some degree, with some exchange and some stack of words so that somebody can go, oh, I'm interested. Please tell me more. You've got 220 to 240 words to do that in. Somewhere mixed into those 220 to 240 words, you're going to need your title in all caps. And just to let you know, shorter titles are still just as effective as they were 5 to 10 years ago. I know. In fantasy, there's that whole move for long-ass titles with multiple forms of punctuation. I know. I don't know why they're doing it either. It makes me roll my eyes just as much as you roll yours about it. But short titles are fine. It's okay. And you package it out, you send it off, and whatever it is. I apparently am thinking about Selena Gomez and not Zendaya. Whatever. You know the person I'm talking about. That's who I'm talking about. I'll Google it later. Although I'm sure somebody's going to text me in a second and tell me, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, it's fine. You know who I mean. You know what I'm talking about. The fact remains that we package this stuff up and it goes out into the world. And in theory, ideally, somebody out there likes your thing just enough to say, sure, I will put a stake in this and say, yeah, sure, I'll make sure you can meet other people and do stuff. Cool. Enjoy. And go from there. What happens after that are the same steps that happen if you were going to publish it yourself. And just so we're clear, I am always going to back you more so if you publish it yourself. Because 1, you won't be murdering a small chunk of the planet. 2, you have way more control. I apparently was correct. I did mean Zendaya. Okay, cool. Sure. Um, Publishing it yourself gives you way more control, gives you way better division of profit, gives you a way better sense of how to do things. The trade-off, though, is that you have to do the work that other people would be doing otherwise. You have to get your own cover. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to make your own cover. I mean, you can if you want, but you have to hire somebody for a cover. You also have to hire an editor. Good news, if you're listening to this, I'm an editor. I'll help you. But you need your book edited. You need your book edited. I don't give a shit what you want to say about software. I don't care at all what you swear you can do yourself. Get a professional in there to help you out. It's going to make the job a lot easier, go a lot faster, and be a lot smoother. Also, I don't know if you know this, but all these steps that you're doing will cost you some money. And you have to know that going in. This is a job. These are the expenses of the job. This is how it is. If you don't want to do that, or you are willing to not, you don't want to spend, and you are okay with the reduced reception you get as a result of not spending, that's fine. That's fine. However, the majority of people want more readers, more consumers, a bigger audience. They want all that stuff. And you're going to get that from producing a better product. You produce a better product by spending some money on it and supporting it. It's just how the system works. Until we, overthrow the system, brothers and sisters, here we are. You need a cover. You need it edited. You need some platform to distribute it on. Perhaps you want to use a giant super mega conglomerate. Perhaps you want to do it yourself. If you want to do it yourself, you need an ISBN. It's going to cost you $25 US. If you want to go for an ISBN and a barcode, I think it's $35. Not entirely sure, but you can get it at the same website. You just have to click a different box. But once you have those things, you can distribute this book in whatever means you want, in whatever format you want. Some formats, if you're trying to aim for specific services or specific platforms, you'll need software to encode it, and that's fine. You can Google it. It's use one giant mega corporation to kind of end around another giant mega corporation. Sure, why not? It's a cyberpunk dystopia we live in. Let's use it to our advantage. But past that, you just need to market science fiction. So, before we jump to questions, before we get into stuff, what marketing works for science fiction depends entirely on two factors. One, who's your audience? Just like always, it's going to come down to, who am I trying to sell this book to? Is it a younger crowd? Is it an older crowd? Is it a crowd looking for a very specific thing? Because your story might be a very specific thing. Is it something to do with trying to say a particular thing about a particular theme? Who knows? Maybe it's a particular plot. Maybe it's a framework. I don't know. Who's your audience? That's going to be a factor. That's going to be a thing. Second thing, though. What element of the story, beyond a character's name, beyond something cosmetic about them, are you willing to put front and center when you talk about this book? You want to talk about the themes? That's a great thing to put front and center. Fantastic thing to put front and center. Themes are good. They're almost always going to be applicable to somebody in some group you're talking to. Maybe it's not theme. Maybe you're super proud of the really neat work you did on world building. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. You got to put something forward. Now, you're not... Now, here's a wrinkle. This can be tough for some people. You're not going to know what the person on the other end of this conversation is going to vibe with. You just don't know. This is the risk. You're going to have to try. It's scary as all hell. I know. I talk into this microphone a lot. I have no idea if one person or two people or 6 people or 12 people or whatever are going to show up. I just got to do it. You just got to get out there and try. So what thing are you putting out there? What thing are you saying, in addition to knowing your audience, what thing is going to help make your book as an item interesting enough to spend money on? That's going to come down to the thing you choose and how well you talk about it. Notice I didn't say how frequently you talk about it. I mean how well you talk about it. Because remember, our goal here is to engage people, to lead them to a point of interest. Ooh, I want more. Please tell me more. If I bombard you with a billion facts, yeah, you'll be just swarmed by things. But if I keep layering fact after fact and keep telling you this and tell you this and tell you this, you're not going to have any of that room to give context, to take a break, catch your breath, figure out how you feel about any of these things. It's too much. And it will have, instead of an attractive effect, it will have an unattractive effect. You'll be annoyed. So let's not do that. But by and large, we want to know our audience and know something about this book that will make it interesting or appealing to some member in that audience. Now, it might be, in the course of you talking about this book and thinking about this book and writing this book, it might be that you have this one thing that everybody, or the vast majority of people, really attach to. Totally fine. Totally super cool. It might not, though. You might have to come and think about a couple different approaches with a couple different things. That's fine, too. In fact, I'm going to even argue that it might even be better. Because that way, you don't just have, one option to go to. You have like 4 or 5 or 2 or 3 or 7 or 9 or however many. But you've got more than one. And that gives you a little bit more adaptability and a little bit more flexibility when you're talking about and potentially leading to sales, which is always to your benefit. I'm looking at my outline and I realize I've just yet again blown through so much of it. So what I want to do is scroll back a second. Let me scroll back. And I want to address a few small things that didn't entirely have what's going on? Oh, okay. That didn't entirely have a place in this. I want to talk about, first and foremost, some of the subdivisions of science fiction. Some of the things that are science fiction that we kind of shuffle off to the side. Things like all the punks. Cyberpunk, diesel punk, hope punk, corn punk, afro punk, vamp punk, goth punk, all those punks. All the other punks that I didn't mention. How many punks are there, by the way? Oh, God, I think there's 42? It's either 42 or 44. There's a list somewhere. You can Google it. I don't know off the top of my head. I know there's tons. All those derivations can, but not necessarily always do, fall under dystopic science fiction. Dystopic science fiction is just a science fiction setup where the living conditions for characters and the existential conditions for characters are not ideal. They can be exaggerated to some degrees, like Mad Max, or they can be slightly kind of tamped down so it's fairly like regular life here, but it's only slightly skewed, like the first third of Interstellar. At least until we get Anne Hathaway in a spaceship. But all the punks, the punk element there speaks to character and theme, whereas the first word that gets attached with the punk, cyber, diesel, hope, corn, etc., deals with the world building. You can make your own punk. The punk element just refers to a character in a sort of a move against the flow kind of way. The rebellious, the pushback kind of way, the nonconformist. That's the word I'm looking for. The nonconformist streak. That's the punk. Just like punks stand against, skinheads. They don't go with the flow. They stand up because they're punks, and punk is awesome. That's significant. Now, whether we have diesel punk or corn punk or whatever, that's just different flavors and different hats, but it's the same concept. There are dystopic fiction types, however, that aren't punk. They're just straight dystopias. And that's where you get into things like where you see science fiction really branch out, like cosmic horror often gets labeled as science fiction because it incorporates some kind of science in the course of its horror. And that's fine. I don't always necessarily agree with it, but last I checked, unfortunately, am not in total control of the entirety of existence yet. I keep hoping, but I'm just me. But science fiction tends to be a big-ass catch-all, especially when you get out to sort of the fringes and you get away from spaceships and you get away from multiple planets. And it's okay. Like, it's not bad to be a science fiction author. It's not bad to be under that umbrella, even if your space under that umbrella is fairly tiny. It's fine. I want to make one big distinction, one kind of big moment, and then we'll see if there's any questions, or we'll get out of here a little bit early. Space opera. This is, hang on, mouthful of water. That way I'm not coughing straight in your faces. Space opera refers to a type of large-scale science fiction that involves the following things. Item number 1, multiple planets. Item number 2, big giant stakes, usually like galaxy-wide, universe-wide, like real big shit happening. Item number 3, the emotions or the risk or both experienced by the characters is huge. Everybody really, really cares. This is really, really super important. Oh my God, it's life or death. It's real extreme. When you have all three of those conditions, you have space opera. When you just have two of those conditions, like I have a lot of planets and there's a universe galaxy ending threat, but it's not, the be all end all of our existence, you just have regular science fiction. You don't have to make your space opera super, super epic. You can have a space opera, it's fine. Do what you gotta do. But by and large, space opera is a flavor of the science fiction ice cream. The other one is space fantasy. We've talked about space fantasy in Wednesday Writer Chats, but space fantasy is science fiction, or it's also called science fantasy, where it's science fiction where the science is less focused on than the fantastic elements of things. So remember in fantasy we had talked about wizards and magic as a construct in the world, where magic is kind of like literally the hand-wavy solution to stuff. I wave my hand and shoot a fireball. In science fantasy, I still move my hand, but I use the force, for example. Or I move my hand and I'm telekinetic. Or I move my hand and I influence this undercurrent of particles and willpower. Who knows? But the fantasy, the fantastic element, is more about the fiction in science fiction than it is about the science. So it's not so much the technology, it's about the fantastic nature of it. It's the unscienceable, is how my professor used to teach us 20 years ago. The unscienceable stuff is science fantasy. But if you can science it, if you can break it down into technology, it's science fiction. Does that distinction matter as much now as it did 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Yeah. Shrug, kinda, a little. People get real pissy about it. That doesn't necessarily make it a big publishing thing, but people sure do love to fight about it, but it's the internet, so it doesn't take much for people to get into fights. But by and large, you're writing science fiction if the story you are writing uses technology, equipment, material, facts, or just straight up science to the advantage of the story, to allow it to have a fantastic or better than now or different than now kind of scenario, kind of development. Science fiction. So whether we're in spaceships on a different quadrant, or whether we're in a galaxy a long time ago far, far away, or whether we're, 2 years from now and we're dealing with the robot apocalypse or whatever, it's all science fiction. And that is everything in my notes. And I am so proud of myself that I managed to get through that without hacking up a lung. So, delightful. Are there, of the, oh my God, half dozen of you or so in chat, are there any questions? As well as the people who are, tweeting, texting, finding me on Signal, etc. Questions? Issues? Anybody? I'm just going to keep drinking tea. By the way, this cold, whatever I've had, it sucks. I don't know if it's like more than a cold, but it sucks. There's a question here, is The Road science fiction? Ooh. I would argue yes. It is not terribly technologically advanced science fiction, but I would say it's science fiction. It contains a scientific element that propels the drama forward. Yeah, I would call that science fiction. Great question. Great question. Others? New people who just came in. Hi, I see you. Hello, everybody. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for checking this out. Questions? I would turn it over to Zoom, but I didn't load Zoom for this. And I would turn it over to YouTube, but it's going to YouTube tomorrow. So for now, just you and me, Twitch, the way it should be. Here's a question. Do I have to defeat the antagonist? Does the antagonist have to die at the end of the book? Yes and no. Yes, because you need some kind of satisfying ending for this story. I know. You've got plans for like 1 million books from now. I get it. I hear you. But you still got to close this loop. You still got to have some kind of satisfying ending. Denying that because you think it's going to propel the reader to the second book, it's not. It's going to irritate them. Yeah, sure, maybe you'll get some carryover, but by and large, they'll just move on to a more satisfying experience. So it would really help if you didn't pin all your hopes on this antagonist and you didn't pin all your hopes on the bait and switch of trying to develop this antagonist so they can get away. You've got to manage this story rather than just stall and delay. Manage the story, make some decisions, close a narrative loop. There was another. So if the cause for the plot or the overall conflict is a scientific element, plague, nuclear war, bioweapons, it's science fiction, even if there's nothing about science. Yes. You don't have to have scientific characters doing science stuff for the story to be science fiction. It's just that science needs to be somewhere in the core of the story's conflict, premise, development, etc. Cool. All right. Other things, other issues, other factors. Oh, dude. That's my tea. Drink your water. Anybody else? Questions, comments, concerns? Else we will do a little bit of housekeeping, and I guess we'll get out of here, buddies. All right. I think. What are my thoughts about keeping the air of dystopia front and center? Love that question. Well, you are more than welcome to do so. Remember, though, that without it being too much, the hard part is dystopia, especially when you want to describe it in its extremes, when you want to make sure the reader gets that it's really bad, it can be very sort of ablative. It can be real smothering. So there's two factors to balance. One, there's the idea of how clearly can I describe it to the reader so that they buy in and understand it. That's going to be a narrative construction. That's going to be a sentence level, writing level thing. That's going to be a how you're telling the story thing. The other factor is within the narrative, with the characters. They know they're in a dystopia. And short of just like being on Twitter all day, where else are you going to find people who constantly just talk about there being a dystopia rather than just being engaged in it? So it can be present. Well, I think, let's preface it that way. I think keeping the dystopia present and felt is different, and I think to the benefit of the writer, than keeping it like constantly refreshed and constantly queued up and constantly aware. But it's a balancing act between getting it across to the reader so that they can buy in versus the characters being able to do something about it or deal with it or cope or whatever. Because the more you keep talking about how bad it is, you run the greater risk of the reader disengaging. Because if you keep telling me how bad it is, why should I bother caring about the characters? You're just going to keep telling me how bad it is. The sacrifice, that's not the right word. That's not the right word. The trade-off, that's the word. The trade-off you want to make between atmosphere and plot development is that in, let's say, the first third of the book, you want plot advancement because you want to keep the story moving and get everything going. But as the book moves under its own inertia, and as we, move towards our particular points that we're making, whatever they might be, and as we're going forward, you can start to bring in the atmosphere to help reinforce its own inertia. It's sort of like when you're riding a bike. Okay, that's maybe not a great example because I've barely ridden one, and I'm doing this from memory from childhood. But there comes a point when you're riding a bike where you don't have to pedal, but the wheels keep turning. And it's the confluence of balance and motion and Newtonian physics that keep you moving forward. The same is true in story writing, where the atmosphere helps contribute to that inertia more so than you making the pedaling, the plot advancement, reignite or recatalyze the story. It's always a balancing act. There's no clear formula for it. It's always going to come down to how the writer is writing. But it's a matter of trying to balance it relative to the voice and relative to the moment. Everybody's going to do it differently over the course of the story, and everybody's going to do it differently in different parts of the story. I will probably revisit that at some point in some other recording. I need to chew on that a little. It's going to stick with me. All right. Other issues, comments, questions, concerns. Side note, this is the Synthwave playlist. This wasn't bad science fiction background music. That's mostly a note for myself later when I play this back when I go to upload it to YouTube. Not bad. Anything else? Else we'll get on out of here. All right. Let's see. Wednesday, I will be right back here, probably with some cough drops, admittedly. I'll be right back here. That's October the 6th. I'll be right back here for the writer's chat. The questions are bangers. They're gonna be. It's gonna be a good one. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I will be slightly medicated and cough droppy, so I'm not planning on canceling. This cold sucks, but I'm not dying, so we're just gonna keep going. There is I will make a determination on Wednesday if there's going to be a Thursday stream where I want to talk about either point of view or I just want to kind of package up a few random disjointed story things that kind of got left out of this episode as well as the last episode of How Do I Write This. It might kind of be a catch-all. It might also just be like a hangout kind of thing. I will make that decision during the Wednesday recording. Yeah. I think that's it because I'm kind of losing my voice. So thank you for being here for this. Thank you for taking this roller coaster ride with me. I know it was a little bit disjointed and chaotic. I swear at one point it was like really well planned. I promise. Like I super promise. But here we are all the same. Thanks for checking this out. This will go on YouTube tomorrow morning. I will, yeah, like a couple hours. It'll be up by lunchtime tomorrow. So noon Eastern at the very latest. It'll be up. Yeah. Thanks for being here. Thanks for spending time with me. I appreciate it. Thank you for your questions. They were great. Thank you for your very supportive tweets, comments, and et ceteras. I hope you're doing well. I hope you take care of yourselves. And I will... Sorry. I will talk to you guys on Wednesday. Oh, yes. One more note before I get out of here. I'm going to end up making a theme music for Monday nights. I'll work on that tomorrow. If you want to follow that for progress, go check out the Discord. That's where I'll be talking about this tomorrow. All right. Have a good night, everybody. I will see you Wednesday for more. See you.